Okay, let's see how this goes. We're going to start with a talk on the major goals of behavioral science, including psychology, and we'll talk a bit about which ones we're going to try and hit this semester with our own research. The first goal of behavioral science, and these are going to kind of go in the order that they have to be tackled, is to describe a behavior and describe behavioral patterns. So this is where you've got to start, right? If you really want to analyze behavior, you first have to be able to really well define it and well describe it. Sometimes you might want to describe a behavior that's very directly observable. So the study could be something like, what is the gait of a running 6-year-old and how is that different than the way an adult moves? If this is what you're going to study, the gait or the way in which a body moves when it's running is very observable, right? We could take out a video camera, film it, and really detail it if we wanted to. Another possibility is studying the loudness of laughter when watching slapstick comedy versus pun-driven comedy. We could certainly put a microphone near a person and we could record their laughter and measure exactly how loud it is. Both of those are very observable, right? You also might want to describe behaviors or patterns that are a little less directly observable. For example, how attractive we find a person. Attractiveness is more amorphous. It's a little harder to directly define. It's not directly observable. I can't look at you and tell how attractive you find, Channing Tatum when you're looking at a picture of him. So I'm going to have to find some different stand-in for the measure of attractiveness, right? I'm not going to be able to just ask you, well, I can just ask you how attractive they are. But what I'm going to get is probably something more like we have in this picture. I'm going to say, rank the attractiveness of this person in the photograph from 0 to 10, and then I'm going to use the number you give, 10, a 9, a 7, a 2, as a representation of how attractive you find a person. But again, the actual attractiveness you feel, I'm not directly observing it. You could say a 9, someone else could say a 9. Can I be certain you both feel the same way about how attractive a person is? Not necessarily, right? We're kind of having to use a little bit of wiggle room there to make the assumption that it's exactly the same because it's not directly observable. But we still might want to study those sorts of less observable things in humans because a lot of what psychologists are interested in, thoughts, feelings, emotions, we cannot directly observe. So let's give an example of describing behavior and the kind of study that you might be doing to describe a behavior. For example, if the thing we're really interested in is this question, is there a relationship between violent behavior and violent TV watching? Before we can even see if there's a relationship, we have to describe or define a bunch of behaviors that are related to this question. So what behaviors would we have to describe and define here before we can even get to this stage of answering this question? There's actually quite a few, right? First things, their relationship between violent behavior. Well, how are we defining violent behavior? What counts? Would we define violent behavior the same for a 6-month-old versus a 6-year-old versus a 60-year-old person? So we might have to be specific depending on who our participants in our study are. Would we include only physical contact? Are we only talking physical violence? Is there other kind of violence? For example, name calling. We would have to decide whether we want to include those kinds of name calling behaviors or emotionally violent behavior or just physically violent, right? It would be kind of hard. We would probably make a specific list, but we'd probably also have to have a broader definition that can capture stuff we hadn't yet thought of. But when we see it in the moment, we say, oh yeah, that's the kind of thing we mean as well. Okay, so we have to define violent behavior and describe it. We've also got violent TV here. What counts as violent TV? I think some things we might say would be pretty easy, right? If you've seen Game of Thrones, there's a lot of violence in that TV show. There are probably some other things that would be pretty easy to say no violence. Sesame Street? I don't know that there's any violence shown in Sesame Street. But there might be some gray areas, right? For example, Powerpuff Girls or My Little Pony. We might see some cartoons that are aimed at relatively young kids, but they do still have a level of violence in the sense that characters might be fighting something, fighting the bad guy, fighting the enemy. Are we counting that as part of our violent TV? Does it matter whether it's, again, being watched by a 5-year-old versus a 50-year-old, or does the same thing count as violent? How much violence happens to occur? If it's a TV show where one time a year they show a violent act, are we counting that as violent TV? We would have to define it, right? You'd have to describe exactly what you mean when you say violent TV. And again, are we only talking about TV that has physical violence? What if someone is emotionally manipulative? Are we going to count that as a violent act? We would have to define and describe it before we could ever study it. And finally, I would argue that we also have to define watching for violent TV watching. I don't know about you guys, but there are times where I technically do have the TV on, but I'm doing other work, right? I'm kind of half listening to it, half hearing it. Usually it's shows I've seen before. Does that count as TV watching? I'm in the room and it's on. What if it's parents watching TV and the kid is just playing with some toys, but the TV is still on? Would we count them watching? How do we know whether they're watching or not watching TV to know whether we want to count it or not? What about people who have multi-screen use, which is so common now? Do we count that the same as if you're just sitting with only the television on, only this program on, as if you're also streaming Instagram and Facebook and you're tweeting, all that kind of stuff? Are we counting that TV watching the same in each case? Before we could even get to the study of seeing whether there's a relationship between violent behavior and violent TV watching, we have to do this first step of describing a bunch of stuff, right? Now, I'm guessing this semester we're not going to be stuck just describing behavior. That is usually the first step in research, and probably someone's done that before we're going to get to the topic. So what's typically the second step? Once you've described and categorized behaviors, you start really noting when they're happening, the next step is often to see if you can predict future behavior based on the patterns you've already started to see. So once you've defined these behaviors and you start collecting data on when those behaviors occur, you might start seeing patterns of behavior, right? Because you've been observing regularly. And once you see any patterns of behavior, you can start to predict future behavior based on the patterns you've already seen. Let me give you an example of that. Previous research has found a relationship between physical attractiveness and leniency in sentencing when you're in front of a judge, such that people who are more attractive tend to get the shortest allowable sentences for committing a crime. Once we see this pattern, and again, we're able to see that pattern because we've described the behavior, we've defined attractiveness in some meaningful way, apparently. We now should be able to use that to predict that if Jane Doe commits a crime and is found guilty, based on her attractiveness, is she likely to get a longer or a shorter sentence, a more or less lenient sentence, right? This is typically our second step, and part of what predicting future behavior can do, it can help us test our pattern. How consistent is this pattern? If it's a really solid pattern, our predictions are going to be more often right. Okay? So let's go back to our watching TV example. If we've observed that there is some kind of relationship between watching TV and acting out violently, then, if we learn that a child watches X hours of violent TV per day, we should be able to predict, for example, how many fights she'll get into in school, right? If we've already seen and we've defined these things, like we've defined violent TV, we apparently have decided to focus on how many fights she gets into, let's say fights at school, fights with her siblings, we've defined what a fight is. If we've watched them long enough and we've seen a pattern, we should be able to predict something now. So I learned that Stephanie watches 2 hours of violent TV per day. I should be able to predict roughly how many fights Stephanie will get into, let's say during a school year or something like that. Now, it's important to note that another piece of figuring out how accurate your prediction is something that we call effect size. Do you think the only thing that influences how many fights a kid gets into in, let's say, a school year, do you think the only thing that influences that is how much violent TV she watches? I don't think any of us would make that guess, right? I think a lot of us would say, no. There are plenty of things that would influence how often you get into a fight. Maybe something about the other students at your school. Are they trying to start a lot of fights? Something about the adult supervision, both in school and at home. Maybe if there's more adult supervision, you're less likely to get into a fight. Maybe there are things about emotional trauma that a kid has or has not experienced. Maybe there's something about how many after-school activities they're involved in that keep them busy, keep them from getting into as many fights. I don't know. There's probably lots of things that would influence whether or not a kid gets into a fight or how often. The effect size that we're talking about here is how much of whether she gets into a fight or how often she gets into a fight. How much of that can be explained just by this one piece, the violent TV watching piece. If we say that there's a large effect size, it means that how much violent TV she watches has a huge effect on how many fights she'll get into. It has a lot of what we would say is explanatory power, or a lot of predictive power. On the other hand, if it has a very small effect size, we're saying it's real, but there's lots of other things that are going to come into play. So we're not going to have such a specific prediction, right? So for example, in our TV watching here, if TV watching has a large effect size on how many fights a kid gets into in a school year, we could be pretty specific. If we know that Stephanie watches 2 hours of violent TV per day, 95% chance she will get into 2 or 3 fights in a school year. That's pretty specific. On the other hand, if this has a very small effect size, meaning there's lots of other stuff that's very important in understanding how many fights she gets into, our prediction might be something more like, if Stephanie watches 2 hours of violent TV per day, then in a given school year, we can be 95% sure she'll get into between 0 and 7 fights in a year. Notice, really big range, maybe not that useful in terms of predictive power. It could still be accurate, but it just doesn't give you much information, right? Typically, this is the second step of studying an area of psychology. You've gone from defining and just recording how often behaviors happen to looking for relationships between those factors to see if you can predict what's going to come if you know a piece of the puzzle. Our second step is to go beyond that to try and determine the cause of behavior, right? We know it's not enough to just predict behaviors. We as psychologists want to know what causes the behavior. One of the reasons we want to understand cause is because if we know the causal relationship, we can make recommendations to changes to make to get a desired outcome. So for example, if we were to learn that watching violent TV causes kids to get into fights at school, well then we might urge parents, don't let your kids watch as much violent TV if you don't want them getting into fights, right? Until we understand cause, we can't make very useful recommendations. So this step of figuring out cause so that you can make recommendations is definitely stepping past correlational research, which was goal 2. We're going past just knowing there's a relationship and understanding how the relationship works. For example, we said that people who are more attractive tend to get more lenient sentences when in front of a judge, right? We haven't said why, we've just seen that there's a relationship there. Another study that relates to attractiveness that I think is a really fun area of research is something called the Red effect. Let me tell you a little bit about the Red effect. It just is this whole body of research that has found that when someone is associated with the color red, meaning they're either wearing the color red or they're standing in front of a red background or something like that, they tend to be rated as more attractive than someone who was wearing blue or standing in front of a blue background. So research has found that men, especially men, research has found that men tend to find women wearing red to be more attractive than those wearing blue. So there's some kind of relationship. Now let's imagine for the moment that the way this study was done, the way we learn that there's this relationship between the color a woman is wearing and how attractive she is found by a man. Let's say the way they did this was just to have people come in their own street clothes. Let's say we were doing it on campus at Missouri Southern. So we just walk around campus and we're looking for people who came to campus either wearing red or wearing blue. And we just photograph them, right? So some people we photograph, they're wearing red. Some people we photograph, they're wearing blue. And we show those pictures to a bunch of men. And we find that men said, people in red, more attractive. People in blue, less attractive. Can we be certain yet that wearing red caused you to be more attractive? Or wearing blue caused you to be less attractive? What other kind of relationship could be there? Could it go the other way? Could it be that being an attractive person attracts you to red, makes you choose to wear red? Being less attractive makes you choose to wear blue? I mean, I don't know. Maybe if you're a really attractive person, or if you're just having a really attractive day, you're feeling really good about yourself, you're feeling really good about the way you look, maybe you pick a bright, vibrant color because you want everyone to be looking at you because you're having a really good, cute day. Maybe on the other hand, if you're just feeling like a blah day, you're not doing your hair, you're not putting on makeup, you're not making an effort, maybe you're not feeling that well, maybe you're just not feeling it, you might choose a darker color to kind of blend into the background, right? So it might be that it's not that wearing red makes you attractive, maybe it's being attractive makes you choose to wear red. Or it could be some other variable that causes both, right? We don't know yet. If we wanted to know whether we should recommend to those people who are about to see the judge for sentencing that they should definitely put on a red sweater, we're going to have to figure out if wearing red causes you to be attractive. How could we determine cause here? What could we do? This one we've definitely done. Instead of just picking people off the street who happen to be wearing red and blue, we have the same one person get photographed twice. Once when they're wearing red and once when they're wearing blue. Or if we want to be even more scientific about it, we photograph them just one time wearing, say, a white t-shirt. And we go in using something like Photoshop and we alter the t-shirt so that in one version of the picture, we turn that shirt red, another version of the picture, we turn that shirt blue. That way, we're sure their hair's the same in both. Their facial expressions are the same in both. The lighting is the same in both. We are altering the picture so that the only thing different between our two versions of this picture is whether the person looks like they're wearing a red shirt or a blue shirt. Now, if we see that participants who see the version of Jane where we've modified it so she's wearing a red shirt, if they rate her as more attractive, in the other case they rate her as less attractive, we can say, aha, it really does look like the shirt color is causing the difference in attractiveness. And by the way, that's what the research sheet seems to show. If we do these very controlled experiments, it does look like people tend to describe a person wearing red or rate a person wearing red as more attractive than if they're wearing other colors. And we see the strongest evidence of this when we have straight cis men evaluating women. So it looks like there might be a romantic attractiveness, connection here going on. Okay, so we had talked about this idea of violent TV and violent behavior. And by the way, we have seen studies that show that these are correlated, that there is some kind of relationship between watching violent TV and acting out in a violent way, such that more TV also tends to mean higher levels of violent behavior. If we just know there's a relationship, would we want to jump to cause yet? What are some other possible relationships? It could be that tending to be a violent person causes you to watch more violent TV. Maybe you're more interested and attracted to violent TV because you tend to be violent yourself. You can relate to it, right? So it's possible that being a violent person causes you to choose to watch more violent TV. It's also possible that there's no causal relationship between the two of these at all. Maybe there's some third factor that's causing both. For example, if we're talking about kids, maybe it's a lack of parental supervision. Let's say don't have a lot of parental supervision in the house. That might lead you to watch more violent TV in the sense that you don't have mom or dad telling you, oh yeah, you're not watching that, right? It's also possible if you don't have parents around in the house, you might act out a bit. Maybe you're frustrated by that. So you might get into a little bit more trouble. Or you're certainly free to do a little bit more of what you want to do. You don't have somebody kind of watching you. So that might lead to more violent behavior. Maybe TV doesn't cause behavior. Maybe behavior doesn't cause TV watching. It's some third factor like lack of parental involvement that's causing both. So how would we test whether watching violent TV causes violent behavior? Apparently my cat has very strong opinions on this. This one's kind of hard. We are definitely going to have to assign some people to watch more violent TV and assign another group of people to watch less or no violent TV for some period of time. And then we're going to have to see how they behave. Does the one group that's watched more violent TV, because we assigned them at random to the more violent TV group, do they act out violently? How about the group that we assigned at random to watch less or no violent TV? Do they act out less violently? This one's kind of hard to do because we have a lot we'd have to control for, but that's what we would want to do if we want to really get at cause. Now, there's a few other pieces of information we can use to help us identify a cause of behavior. So let's go over these. They're also in your book. The first one is called temporal precedence. What does that mean? All this means is something is more likely to cause something else if it always happens before that thing. In our violent TV example, watching violent TV has to happen before you act violently for it to be possible that the TV caused the violent behavior, right? If a kid punches their sister before they ever even watched a TV program, then they watch the violent TV program, obviously that TV program didn't cause the punch. The punch happened before you even started watching TV, right? So this one doesn't prove that watching violent TV causes violent behavior, but it can eliminate the possibility if it goes the other way. Again, if we see a kid punch their sister, then watch a violent cartoon, we would not conclude that watching the violent cartoon caused them to react violently, because the violence came first. For something to be a cause, it has to have temporal precedence, meaning it has to come before the effect. Here's another one. It's not proof, but it's a suggestion that there may or may not be a cause and effect relationship going on, which is something called the covariation of cause and effect. If you have perfect covariation of cause and effect, when the cause is present, the effect will always occur. And when the cause is not present, the effect will never occur. Again, that would be an example of perfect covariation. Every time you see the cause, you see the effect. Every time a kid watches a violent cartoon show, they punch their sister. And whenever the kid does not watch a violent TV show, they never punch their sister. That would be perfect cause and effect. This would be simple if there was one and only one cause of a complex behavior like violent behavior. If only the only thing that causes it is watching violent TV. But we already said that's not going to be the only reason kids act out violently. There's probably lots of things that would affect violent behavior in kids. So in the field of psychology, we rarely see a perfect covariation of cause and effect. But if watching violent TV does tend to lead to violence, we should see that more of one, more watching TV, relates to more often a violent act. And when we don't see as much of that cause happening, we don't see as much of the behavior as well. We should see some level of it, even if it won't be a perfect match. Again, it doesn't prove there's a cause. It's just something we'd expect to see if there is a cause and effect relationship. Another thing we try and do is we try and eliminate alternative explanations. So, for example, perhaps it's true that kids who watch more violent TV act more violently, but maybe the reason that they can get away with watching more violent TV is that they're left at home and unsupervised. So we would want to see, can we look for cases where parents are giving lots of the same level of parental involvement, just one group, their kids watch a lot of TV and one group, or violent TV, and the other group, the kids don't. If we have this naturally occurring system where we've got, let's say, 100 parents who are all equally involved with their kids, more or less, and maybe half of those parents have decided we don't watch violent TV in our house, and the other half of the parents have said we're okay with some level of violence. Now, if we still see that the kids who watch violent TV act out more violently, at least in this case, it's not about parents being involved or not involved, because we got rid of that possibility by having a whole big group of heavily involved parents. We're trying to eliminate alternative explanations. Now, it could be that we're just not creative enough to think of the real explanation. So again, this doesn't prove cause, but it helps strengthen the case if you can eliminate a bunch of alternative explanations. And then finally, the best way to get evidence to support the idea that A causes B is to use a specific kind of research methodology. There's one kind of research methodology that gives us the sort of data we need to help support a case of cause. Do you guys know what that is? You probably already do. This is a true experiment. And since this class is called experimental psychology, that's probably a hint that we are going to be doing true experiments in this class. So when I asked you to think a little bit about which of these goals of behavioral science we're going to try and tackle this semester, well, at least part of what we're going to do is to try and give us some information about cause, because we are going to truly manipulate what our participants experience and see if we have a different outcome depending on which research condition they were in. Okay, so 3, we're trying to figure out cause. And then 4, the fourth goal of behavioral research is to try and explain behavior, which often goes past just cause. Why does A cause B? Let's say we've learned that watching violent TV causes violent behavior. Why does it cause it? Let's say we've learned that being more attractive causes you to get a more lenient sentence in a criminal justice system. Why? Why are attractive people getting more lenient sentences? Even if we don't have cause, if we just know that there's a correlation or a relationship going on, if we see that certain variables tend to go together, why are they correlated? What's the explanation for it? Not only do we want to explain the pattern we see, but we also would want to explain the exceptions to the rule. Why is this not a perfect relationship? There are absolutely people who watch a lot of violent TV who have never hurt a fly, right? There are plenty of people who are extremely physically attractive who've gotten the maximum sentence for a crime they've committed. Why? Why do we have these exceptions to the general pattern we see? Why do you sometimes have A and not have B if A tends to cause B? We can't do this explanation piece until we have very clearly defined all of our terms, right? We've defined our behaviors, we've explained them, we have kept track of them to look for pattern. We've gone past pattern where we can to look at cause. It's only once we've done all of that stuff that we might be able to get to this step. Why does the relationship exist? And why is it not a perfect relationship? This goes back to the idea of predicting behaviors and making recommendations. If we want people to change their lives based on what we found in our study, we're probably going to need to be able to explain why these kinds of patterns and relationships exist and when they might not work the way they generally do, right? Keep all 4 of these goals in mind when you are reading other people's research. Which level are they working at? 1, 2, 3, or 4? Also keep it in mind when you're framing your own research, especially for senior thesis, where you have a lot of freedom over what you want to do and are going to do exactly for your own research. Which one of those levels do you want to be working at? Now, our projects for this class, should say project, we only have 1 this semester. We are all going to be doing an experiment. It's experimental psychology, so we're going to be doing a true experiment. And specifically, we're going to do an experiment that uses a 2x2 factorial ANOVA design. If you don't know quite what those words mean at the moment, that's okay. I know you all have heard about ANOVA. I know you've all run them. So even though you might have forgotten or not remember a lot of details, I know that's familiar. But if the 2x2 factorial part is a little new, well, I'm going to introduce some of that to you right now. A 2x2 factorial design means we are going to be doing a study that has 2 independent variables, or IVs, used in the study. And remember, an independent variable, or IV, researchers can assign participants to a condition at random. This is the thing that the researcher manipulates to see if it has an effect. Now, you can do research with either something that's called a true IV, or we usually just call it an IV, or something called a pseudo IV. So I wanted to make sure that you knew the difference between them already right to start us out. So with an IV, researchers, sorry, there's a missing R there, can assign participants to a condition at random. So you are truly assigning your research participants to the research condition. So for example, in our study of attractiveness and the effect of color, a true IV that you might want to study is the effect of the color red on an attractiveness rating. And maybe we're just comparing red and blue. So if for our study, my participant will see a photo either of a woman wearing a red shirt or a photo of the same woman wearing a blue shirt, I get to assign fully whether a participant sees the red shirt condition or the blue shirt condition. I can assign it at random. Maybe I make it that every other person, I switch between which color they see, right? That's up to me, the researcher. I have power over that, which means this is truly an independent variable because I can assign participants to a condition at random. On the other hand, there are also something called pseudo IVs, or pseudo independent variables. These are characteristics a participant already has themselves, and it cannot be manipulated by the researcher. For example, let's say something I wanted to see is whether the age of a research participant influences how strong this red effect is, right? Does an 18-year-old respond to the woman in the red versus blue shirt in the same kind of way that an 80-year-old does? I can't assign participant age to my participant. I can't assign them at random to be either 18 or 80. You are a certain age when you come to me if you're my research participant, right? I don't get to say to you guys in the room, today you're 20, you over there you're 40, you over there you're going to be 60. No, you are what you are, right? But I still might want to see the kind of effect that age has on the attractiveness ratings. Because I can't assign them at random, we call it a pseudo IV. There's more chance for error here. There's more chance that it's not your age exactly that is the thing that's changing the rating of attractiveness, that it's some other factor that correlates with age. So we're more cautious in our conclusions we draw when we use a pseudo IV. Pseudo IVs are also a pain in the butt because you want to have even numbers of people in all of your research conditions. You can do that when you assign at random, right? I assign that every other person gets either a photo of a woman wearing red or a photo of that same woman wearing blue. I can be sure that my number of people who saw a woman in red shirt is pretty darn even to number of people who saw a woman in blue shirt a little more easily, right? But if I want age to be my category, I don't have so much control over who's going to walk in the door to be part of my study. If I want to do a study, maybe we don't pick 18 and 80, but if we're doing the research on campus and we want people who are, I don't know, 18 to 25 as one category and older than 25 as the other, we're trying to get younger and older, I can't guarantee that half the people who come in to be a part of my study fall into one age category and the other half fall in the other. So pseudo IVs are also kind of annoying because it's hard to get even numbers because you don't get to assign them, right? So what we're going to try and do is use true IVs for our study. Again, we're going to need 2 of them. We're going to try and use true independent variables for this study. More than anything, it's just for the ease of data collection. The most common pseudo IV that people like to do is sex, looking at males versus females. But I can tell you, trying to get roughly even number of men and women in the study is very hard. It doesn't happen. Women participate a lot more. And your data is just not as meaningful. So we're going to try and find 2 true IVs, things we can ourselves as the researchers manipulate to try and get more evenly spread data. But if as a class we're all sold on some pseudo IV and we all just love it, we're open to doing at least 1 pseudo IV. But again, I'm going to try and push us to 2 true IVs. It'll be a little easier, trust me. Finally, we have to have at least 1 dependent variable. Remember, I know this is a review. The independent variable is the thing the researcher manipulates to see if it has an effect, which means the dependent variable is the thing you measure. The dependent variable is what you measure to see whether the independent variable had an effect, to see whether you get some kind of different score between your different research groups. We will have, typically, people will choose 1 dependent variable. They're going to pick 1 thing they want to measure to see if their IVs had an impact. As a class, if we decided there are 2 kind of related things people want to know about, we could choose to do more than 1 dependent variable. We might choose to do 2. I don't know that you want to do 3, 4, 5. That's just getting to be kind of complicated, but we could, depending on what you want to know. We'll talk more about specific kinds of IVs and DVs coming up in a future lecture. So that's a good place to stop for now.